The Dallas Stars are in search for a new head coach. And on today's episode, we will talk about some of the biggest names in the head coaching market. We will talk about Pete DeBoer, Barry Trotz, and of course, Rick Tochett as well, and talk about why they could or could not be the perfect fit for the Dallas Stars to be the new head coach in the 22-23 season. We'll talk about it all on today's episode of Locked On Stars.
You're Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily podcast covering the Dallas Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, credentialed member of the Dallas Stars media, coming to you on this Tuesday, May 24th. And whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring listener, thank you for stopping by today's show and for making Locked On Stars your first listen of the day. Be sure to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcasting platform or on YouTube as well. We just crossed the 300 subscriber threshold on YouTube. A big thanks to you guys for that. You can also find me and our show on Twitter at Dane_Lewis and at Locked On Stars. So be sure to keep it tuned in here all offseason long for all of your Dallas Stars hockey news, updates, insight, hot takes, and of course, some guest appearances as well. And before we jump into today's episode, just do want to address for the YouTube crowd, you've probably noticed my background is just an ever-changing carousel at this point, and kind of has been for the past week or so. Been traveling some for work, but also in the process of moving apartments. And so I'm recording in my old apartment, probably for the last time before moving to the new one. And so it's very empty. So I do apologize if the audio is a little echoey for those of y'all just listening on audio only. For those of you on YouTube, sorry that the background has not been consistent. But I am thankful that I do get to continue to record and make episodes despite moving around from place to place throughout the past few weeks. So sooner rather than later, we will be back to a traditional backdrop setup for those of you on YouTube who care about the aesthetics of the show. But nonetheless, the show must go on, and there is a lot to talk about because the Dallas Stars have a coaching vacancy at the time of recording this. I mean, Rick Bowness was let go. He stepped down as head coach of the Dallas Stars this past Friday, and Jim Nill and the front office did make it known that the search for a new head coach has already begun, and I figure they're going to want to find somebody to bring in pretty soon. The sooner, the better, to get this guy acclimated to living in Dallas, acclimated to being around any players that he would come into contact with this summer, so the relationships can start now. So that way there isn't the weird get-to-know-you phase during training camp, and the team can hit the ground running and get to work and get prepared for the season ahead. And I kind of want to take some time today to talk about some head coaching candidates. And if you guys like this episode, or if you guys leave some comments down below of some candidates maybe that I'm forgetting to mention, we'll maybe have to do a part 2, maybe even part 3 of this series, talking about potential coaching candidates, or the Stars could hire one of these guys or somebody else, before we could get to make part 2 or 3. It's a crazy world in professional sports, especially in the NHL, and movements and hirings can happen in an instant. We all know that. So, I mean, I could put this episode out on Tuesday, Tuesday morning, and the Dallas Stars could have a new head coach by lunchtime on Tuesday. So that's just how the world works. But nonetheless, let's talk about 3 really interesting candidates for the Dallas Stars head coach position, starting with Pete DeBoer, who just got fired from his job in Vegas. He was the coach of the Golden Knights, who came in after their Stanley Cup Finals appearance. But Pete DeBoer is such an interesting coach, and it was interesting, I think, that he got let go, fired from Vegas, just because, I mean, this is a new franchise, the second youngest franchise in the league right now, and they've had some pretty good success. I mean, they missed the playoffs this year, and this is the first time in their short existence that they've missed out on the postseason, but they just missed it. And this was an insanely chaotic year for the Vegas Golden Knights, so much happened with them that we don't even have time to go into, as far as cap space and LTIR. And just so many other things happening. The departure of Marc-Andre Fleury in the offseason, just so many different distractions and obstacles for this team to overcome. And I feel like Pete DeBoer did a pretty good job of still almost getting this Golden Knights team to the playoffs. And who knows how they would have done against a team like Calgary or Colorado. I mean, because Colorado handled the Predators pretty easily. I feel like they probably would have done something similar to the Stars. And who knows how they would have played against the Flames. The Flames are just such an odd team right now in the grand scheme of the postseason. But the rest of his time in Vegas was pretty successful. I mean, he made it to the conference finals in 2019 and the 2019-2020 season, where they did lose in 5 games in the conference finals to, of course, the Dallas Stars. We all know this. And then he made it to the conference semifinals with the Vegas Golden Knights in the 2020-2021 season. So 2 playoff appearances in 3 seasons with this team, and almost made it in his most recent season. And, he kind of just has this similar history, kind of a repetitive history with his head coaching stints. I mean, he, had 2 really solid playoff appearances with the Vegas Golden Knights, missed the playoffs. But even you look back at the previous spots that he coached in, he made 2 Stanley Cup Finals appearances throughout his coaching career. He went in 2012 with the New Jersey Devils, where they lost to the Kings, and he went in 2016 with the San Jose Sharks, where they, of course, lost to the Pittsburgh Penguins. But both of those appearances in the Stanley Cup Finals were in his first season as the head coach of those respective clubs, New Jersey and San Jose, which is just incredibly wild and unheard of. I mean, taking teams that were basement dwellers, were disasters of franchises, for lack of a better term, and turning them around and making it immediate. I mean, this wasn't just, we're taking a bad team and, making it to the first round of the playoffs, or being a wild card team, taking them to the cusp of being Stanley Cup champions, which is just absolutely insane. And it's impressive to do it once, but he did it twice. And part of it is just due to how well, that he coaches his teams. And you even look at his first season with the Vegas Golden Knights. They went all the way to the conference finals, and one of the most chaotic years in professional sports history in what was the 2019-2020 NHL season. I mean, having to fight through all that adversity. We talk about the Stars fighting through adversity in the bubble. All those other teams had to do it as well. And the Vegas Golden Knights made it all the way to the conference finals, which can't be overlooked. Again, in his first season as a head coach. And, it's just one of those things where you could make the argument, okay, well, Pete DeBoer is a good regular season coach, and he can get his team to the playoffs, and they can make deep playoff runs, but he's never able to finish the job. And, it's not something that can be all pegged on him. I mean, he does have those 2 Stanley Cup Finals appearances, conference finals appearance with the Vegas Golden Knights in his first season, but never has he been able to win the Stanley Cup as a head coach. And I think that's going to probably be the biggest knock against him, as far as, making the case for him to be the next head coach or to not be the head coach, is that, he just can never really push his team to the finish line or push his team to the end. But, I feel like that's kind of an unfair criticism, because he is a coach who does get pretty good results, and does, have a pretty successful track record as far as making the postseason and, again, making those deep runs. I mean, sometimes it just happens where you make it to the Cup Finals and you don't win. I mean, maybe it's only a matter of time, and it as bad or cheesy as it sounds, I mean, it kind of means that he's due for a chance to win the Stanley Cup Finals. And maybe that could be in Dallas, or maybe it would be in another city. But he certainly has the experience to be an NHL head coach, especially for a club like the Dallas Stars. And I think that he is somewhat similar to Rick Bowness, but maybe even a little bit better in terms of how he's able to create lineups that are diverse in age. I mean, he did it with the San Jose Sharks with guys like Joe Thornton, Joe Pavelski, Thomas Hertl. Just really, really impressive stuff, mixing these older veteran guys, these middle-aged guys. I guess Pavelski was quote-unquote middle-aged at that time as far as an NHL career. And then Hertl and a bunch of other younger Sharks players that have now kind of emerged as the stars and leaders of the franchise. DeBoer was having to find ways to, put those guys on lines together and make them work together well collectively as a team. And it worked out pretty well. He had a lot of success in San Jose. And I think a big part of that was due to his coaching style of being able to mix those younger players with the older players as well, which is, something that you want every NHL coach to be able to do if you are a fan of any team. But he actually, it wasn't just something he preached about doing. It was something he actively did. And so I think that could be a strength if he were to come to a city like Dallas that has a plethora of older guys on the roster, but also a good amount of young talent on the NHL roster already, but also even at the development level with guys that could potentially be seeing NHL action within the next few years. So he might not be my first choice. He might not be many people's first choice to be the Stars' next head coach, but he would certainly be an intriguing option with his experience and his history and ability to make really effective lineups with diverse age groups. But we're going to continue to talk about Dallas Stars head coaching candidates. After we take a quick break, we will talk about Barry Trotz and make the case for him as the next head coach of the Dallas Stars. Today's episode of Locked On Stars is brought to you by our friends at Built Bar. Imagine if you could lick that brownie spatula that you use whenever you're making brownies. You could lick it clean. You know how your parents would let you do that because it tastes so good. It tastes like brownie, but it's still, in that nice, soft form of the brownie mix, and you want to eat it, but it's so bad for you. Well, imagine if you could do that, but also get some protein in. Well, you're in luck because Built Bar has a new creation, and this one is better than ever. The Brownie Batter Puff. You heard me right. This puff takes protein bars to a whole new level, and they're available right now on Built Bar's website. Have you tried the Built Bar Puffs yet? I'm not sure what you're waiting for if you haven't. Puffs are chocolate-covered marshmallow protein bars. That's right. They are delicious, flavored marshmallow covered in 100% real chocolate with only 140 calories, 17 grams of protein, and only 7 grams of sugar. Brownie Batter Puffs are the perfect pick-me-up for any day of the week, and you can get yours at Built.com. You can go there right now and use our promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your order. Again, use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off your order at Built.com. Moving on this Tuesday episode of Locked On Stars, this is your host, Dane Lewis. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your next listen, check out the Locked On Now podcast, nightly recaps of every NHL game with analysis from our local experts. It's free and available wherever you get your podcast. If you're wanting to keep up with the rest of the Stanley Cup playoffs, you'll want to check out the Locked On Now podcast to get all of your insight from our local experts. But let's continue to talk about the future of the Dallas Stars as it pertains to behind the bench in the world of head coaching. We talked about Pete DeBoer in the last segment, and in this segment, I want to talk about Barry Trotz, another very hot name on the NHL coaching carousel, not just for Dallas, but for other teams as well who are looking to fill a head coaching vacancy. And just like DeBoer, the firing of Trotz was very interesting and very odd to me, as well as many other people, because similar to his time with Vegas, with DeBoer, Trotz had quite a bit of success as the coach of the New York Islanders, where he last was a head coach up on Long Island for this team. He coached them for 4 seasons and made the playoffs in 3 of those seasons. As we know, that the Islanders did miss out on the postseason this year in what was a top-heavy Eastern Conference. But again, they were a very underrated team that just had the weirdest year. I think they played, 17 games, their first 17 games of the season on the road with their new arena. Of course, every team losing players in the expansion draft to Seattle. Maybe, this Islanders team losing a little bit of talent in the offseason, and of course, having to play 17 straight road games to start the year in, again, a very top-heavy Eastern Conference and a tough Metro division with the likes of the Hurricanes, the Penguins, the Rangers. It's just a tough outing for the Islanders this year, yet they were still a pretty competitive team. They were a very scrappy team that gave Dallas a little bit of trouble, as well as some other teams across the league. And so they missed the playoffs this year, but not by much. And they certainly were not a bad team this season, just kind of an unfortunate, some people that just were dealt a bad hand this round. But you look at Trotz's other seasons with the Islanders. In the 18-19 season, they made it to round 2 of the playoffs where they lost to the Hurricanes. In the 19-20 season, they went all the way to the conference finals and lost to the eventual Stanley Cup champion Lightning. And then the next year, they would lose to the Lightning again, but in the second round of the playoffs. So, I mean, that's certainly not something to hang your head on. I mean, losing to the eventual Stanley Cup champs, obviously that means they were a good team, not a fluke to lose to them. And, even that 2020 season, they were right on the cusp of making the Stanley Cup finals. I mean, that was a really competitive playoffs for that Islanders squad. And I think they took a lot of people by surprise in the bubble. And then they kind of almost did it again the next season, playing Tampa Bay a second time in the second round. But of course, losing and falling short. So it's really interesting that Trotz has been let go and removed from his duties in New York, because it seemed like he was doing a pretty good job, especially with all the adversity that had been thrown his way, whether it was going to the bubble, whether it's having to play over 10 road games to start the season, you name it, tons of other stuff thrown his way. But this is another guy that definitely has the pedigree of a successful NHL coach. He, of course, won the Stanley Cup back in 2018 with the Washington Capitals. After 3 second-round exits, the first 3 seasons he coached in DC. In his 4th season, he was finally able to lift Lord Stanley above his head and bring the championship back to Washington, D.C. Alex Ovechkin gets his Stanley Cup. A really interesting series with the Vegas Golden Knights making the Stanley Cup Finals in their first season of existence. And then, of course, they fall to the Washington Capitals. And you even go back to his time with Nashville. He was the very first head coach of the Nashville Predators franchise and was there for a long time, 1998 to 2014. And they missed the playoffs their first 5 years. But then after that, they would go on to make the postseason 7 out of the next 8 seasons. So Trotz just has a history of rallying guys and, taking them to their next level. Obviously, starting out as an expansion team like Nashville was back in the late 90s. They weren't very good. Not a whole lot of people expected them to be good. But then, after patience and kind of shuffling pieces around, they eventually make the playoffs, and they've, been at least consistent, perennial playoff team, or at least competitive, competing for a spot in the playoffs, really, ever since Trotz was there coaching them, and even after he left, the Nashville Predators doing pretty well. But of course, it all started with Trotz back in the late 90s. And whenever it comes to coaching comparisons and talking about potential replacements for Rick Bowness, a lot of people in the national media talking about how Trotz and Bowness coach very similarly, just the way they structure their teams and what emphasis is that a word? I don't know if it's a word, but we're rolling with it, that they put on their squads on a game-by-game basis. They both focus on suffocating defenses, puck management, heavy forechecks that lead to effective offense. Trotz does it a little bit different than Rick Bowness, and unfortunately, with this being a podcast, it's hard to break that down with X's and O's because I don't have a fancy whiteboard or a video board behind me. But of course, you can find all this information online yourself. But they do have very similar coaching styles. And that's something that has been said ever since Trotz was fired. And it was reported that, or not reported, but just kind of speculated that Bowness would be on his way out of Dallas whenever the season ended for the Stars, that Trotz might be a good replacement for Rick Bowness. And people say, okay, well, if it's the same coaching style, why would we believe that that would work for the Stars? And how would that get them into the postseason? Well, I think Trotz's track record kind of speaks for itself with just the success that he's had, winning a Stanley Cup in 2018, getting the New York Islanders to the conference finals in 2020, losing to the eventual Cup champs this previous season. I mean, he isn't as successful as some other coaches around the league, doesn't have as many trophies or, Stanley Cup finals appearances, but still, I think that he gets results and he gets the most out of his players. And again, I mean, the Stars are going to have a similar personnel to what they've had the past few years. It might not be a terrible idea to continue to kind of hit on the same focus points, although we also have talked about the potential of getting an offensive-minded coach to cater to the needs and abilities of guys like Rope Hintz and Jason Robertson. So it'll be interesting to see if the Stars want to pursue Barry Trotz as the next head coach, because it might just be the second coming of Rick Bowness, or it could be a little bit different. Of course, we'll just have to wait and see if he does get a phone call interview and if he eventually does get hired by the Stars, or if he will go coach somewhere else. But coming up after another quick break, we will finish out today's topic of potential new head coaches for the Dallas Stars. And after we come back from a quick break, we will talk about Rick Tochett. We're moving right along on this Tuesday episode of Locked On Stars. This is your host, Dane Lewis. You can find me on Twitter at Dane_Lewis and our show as well at Locked On Stars. And want to close out today's episode with maybe a little bit of a dark horse coaching candidate to fill the head coaching role for the Dallas Stars, a guy that might not even be coaching in the NHL next season because he has not coached at all this past season. He was behind the desk as a TV analyst on TNT. And Rick Tochett, like I said, the least experienced of the candidates I've talked about on today's show, but he's a guy that I've seen kind of circulating the news cycles around amongst NHL media of potential head coaches, not just for the Stars, but for other teams looking for a new skipper as well, to use the baseball term that I hear more often than not when it comes to managers, head coaches. I don't know. That felt a little bit right, I guess. We'll see. But Tocchet, definitely not as much experience as Trotz or DeBoer. He did coach for the Tampa Bay Lightning for 2 seasons, where the Lightning missed out on the playoffs. That was the 08-09 season and the 09-2010 season. Then after that, he coached in Arizona from 2017 to 2021, where they did have one playoff appearance in the Edmonton bubble in 2020, where they lost in 5 games to the Colorado Avalanche. So not a very lengthy track record of coaching and not a very successful track record of coaching. Of course, really short stint with the Tampa Bay Lightning. And then, of course, we all know the Arizona Coyotes have not been a very good team or franchise in the past few years. And so how much of that can really be blamed on Tocchet as a coach? I mean, having to work with, a depleted roster and franchise with Arizona, and then even Tampa Bay. Definitely not the Tampa Bay team that won the Cup a few years before he was the coach, and definitely not the Tampa Bay team that exists at this moment in time. A Tampa Bay team that just swept the President Trophy winning Florida Panthers. I mean, in a shocking turn of events. I was expecting that to be a much more competitive and exciting series, and the Florida Panthers don't even get a win. They don't even score a goal in Game 4, a win or go home game for them. But I digress there. We'll talk about the Stanley Cup playoffs maybe a little bit later on. But Tocchet has not coached for the Coyotes since the end of the 21 season. And he is, again, like I said, currently on TV as a member of the NHL on TNT crew. And so I think it's kind of, I say he's a dark horse coaching candidate for a lot of teams because it might be a little bit risky to go pursue a guy like Tocchet, who does have coaching experience. Again, not a whole lot of successful coaching experience, but coaching experience nonetheless. Maybe he would do better with a team like Dallas that has some talent on the roster now, or maybe even somewhere else as well. But it would be risky to get a guy who's been a little bit more relaxed, who's just been on TV for the past year, probably taking it a lot easier than he would be if he was the head coach of an NHL team. So not as many benefits with Tocchet as you would see with Trotz or DeBoer. But at the same time, it could be one of those things that if the right team takes a risk on him, it could work out and pay huge dividends for that franchise going forward. And he could be an absolute steal. So I don't really expect this one to happen for the Dallas Stars, but definitely keep an eye out for it. I'm really curious to see where Rick Tocchet goes, if he goes anywhere at all this offseason. Maybe he's satisfied with the career that he's made for himself on television now, and maybe he'll stick with that for the next few years, or maybe he'll want to get back into the action and get behind an NHL bench. Whether that's with the Dallas Stars, that is only something that we'll figure out as time continues to go on. But those are just a few of the biggest names I've seen circulating NHL news cycles as far as potential next head coaches for the Dallas Stars. But that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Stars. Thank you again for making us your first listen of the day. Now make your second listen of the day the Locked On NHL podcast. From the first round matchups to each Stanley Cup kiss, Locked On NHL covers the playoffs like no other. Hear the latest news and opinions from local experts every Monday through Friday. That show is free and available wherever you get your podcast at, just like the Locked On Stars podcast, where you can subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform, as well as on YouTube. You can, of course, always leave a rating, review, or a comment if you like what you hear. Be sure to let me know down below in the comments who you would like to see as the next head coach of the Dallas Stars. Maybe it's one of the 3 guys we talked about today, or maybe it's somebody else that I've missed entirely. Do let me know down below who you would like to see as the next head coach of the team in Victory Green. But be sure to find me on Twitter as well at Dane_Lewis. That's at DANE 2_LEWIS. You can also find and follow our show on Twitter as well at Locked On Stars. But that's going to do it for today's episode, Stars fans. We will see you back here tomorrow for more Dallas Stars offseason content.